So, good morning if you've just joined us. A very warm welcome to Philosophy Live. My name is Christine Lambie. I'm your host today. And we are exploring here one of Britain's most popular, most loved 20th century poets, T S Eliot. And this famous poet studied Indian philosophy, that's our context, and Sanskrit. Now, let me say straight away, we will be taking some questions from viewers as we go along. So please put some questions in the chat as this proceeds. I'm really delighted to introduce a guest speaker who has been reading T S Eliot over decades. I'd like to introduce you to Rex Howard, who is head of the School of Practical Philosophy in Brisbane, and he has been reading Eliot since childhood. So good morning, Rex.
Morning.
Or good evening, of course it is where you are, isn't it? It's a long way away. So let's jump straight in. Who was T S Eliot? Can you tell us a bit about him?
Well, T S Eliot, although he's normally associated with England, was in fact born in the United States. He was born in St. Louis in Missouri. His family originated from Boston, in fact, and they're sometimes what you would call Boston Brahmins, sort of the upper class Bostonians. His grandfather moved from Boston to Missouri to set up a Unitarian church. He was a minister. That's why the family were living in Missouri. Eliot went to Harvard for his university, where he completed his undergraduate courses, and then he continued with a master's degree in philosophy. So that's sort of where his interest in philosophy started there. He also took an interest in Indian philosophy and Sanskrit, as you mentioned earlier. He started studying Sanskrit as part of his master's degree and got a scholarship to go to the UK. So he's got a scholarship to continue his studies at Oxford University. And so he arrived in England in about 1914. Sort of unpropitious time, really.
Yes.
Where he was one of the most. The descriptions of Oxford at the time indicate that most of the students there were Americans. Anyway, he completed his studies there and went on to work in a bank as a clerk originally. Eventually became a director of Faber, what is now known as Faber and Faber, the publishing company. While basically writing his poetry in his spare time. In 1948, he was awarded a Nobel Prize for Literature for his outstanding contributions to the development of poetry, English poetry.
Okay, let's take a look at him. We've got a picture here. Would you like to tell us something about that photograph? What do you see in that?
That's a fairly early photograph. So you're probably from in his late 20s, early 30s. At this stage, it looks to me like he's just sort of establishing himself. That would be the period he was becoming known as a poet and had published a number of works by this stage. He had a difficult life, and I sort of see in this photograph sort of some behind his eyes a sort of sense of difficulty that he had in life. He had a lot of financial problems early on, that sort of went as he got more and more established, but originally very difficult financially. His first marriage was a disaster, largely. His first wife ended up in a mental institution and died there, was subject to ill health most of her life. So he had a difficult time.
Yes, you can't. I think you see that in the photograph, don't you? The sort of intensity and slightly troubled, isn't it?
Slightly troubled, I'd agree. That's right, yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me just go back to that other view. So I know you're going to introduce us to some of your favorite lines, or probably most quoted lines. Would you like to just set the context before I show the quote?
Yes, the quote that we're going to look at comes from one of his later works called Four Quartets, the first part of the Four Quartets. This is an interesting set of poems. The first one was published in 1935 as a separate poem called Burnt Norton, which this quote comes from. It was actually started as an extract from his play, Murder in the Cathedral. He was edited down part of the play, and the passage that he took out became the core of Burnt Norton. That's sort of its genesis. Murder in the Cathedral was first performed in 1935, at the time that this poem was first published. The later works or later parts of the four quartets were completed during the Second World War. So they were published in 1940, 41. He was an air raid warden at the time. There's an interesting story in one of these books, or the publication of his prose, that said if he had been at the building of Faber and Faber on a different night when a bomb exploded in Russell Square, that book of works by Eliot would have been considerably thinner.
Oh, shame.
So
okay, let's have a look at his quote. Like to take us through that and just explain it a bit to us?
So this is probably one of his most quoted lines, the opening of this poem. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement. I might just pause there and say something about that. It seems to me that he's trying to describe something which is indescribable here. And he uses quite a sort of an Upanishadic approach in negation. So it's neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, neither arrest nor movement. So this is trying to describe something which is really beyond description. It carries on, neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline. Again, this negation of alternatives, and I think the idea here is again to negate this, even the sense of movement, sort of neither from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline. It continues, except for the point, the still point. There would be no dance, and there is only the dance. I can only say there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. And again, the concluding part of this passage again attempts to describe that which is beyond description. So this still point even is beyond being still. But the whole movement of creation, what he refers to as the dance here, relies entirely on this still point for its existence. So it's a very metaphysical piece of poetry.
Yes. And the dance, what dance is he talking about? Can you say something about that?
Well, I think this refers to the dance of the universe, of the creation, that looking at the movement of the world as being like a great dance, revolving around this still point, which seems to be unapproachable. I think it's interesting, he talks about, I can only say there we have been, but I cannot say where. And I think this alludes to an experience that he had, or experiences that he had of transcendence, moving beyond the ordinary realm of existence into something beyond. And as he says in the poem, he could say that he had been there, but he can't say where that is. It's sort of described by its sort of non-existence in a funny sort of way.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And you've touched on this already. Would you like to say a little bit more about what sense he was a philosopher? You said he studied philosophy at a university.
Originally, he was an academic. So his postgraduate work, his master's degree, and his doctorate, he worked towards a doctorate, and that was in philosophy. He studied 20th century philosophy, and his thesis, the doctoral thesis, was on a 20th century philosopher. He never got the degree because he didn't finish all of the requirements. I think he had to do a vocal examination, an oral examination, which he never got around to doing. So he wrote the thesis, but never was awarded the doctorate. But that was in philosophy. As we said earlier, he studied Indian philosophy. He read the Bhagavad Gita in the original, in the Sanskrit.
Wow.
He read the Upanishads in the original. He read quite a number of Buddhist texts as well, and indicated a great interest in Buddhism. In fact, as one of his associates said that at about the time he was considering converting to Anglicanism, which he did in 1927, he prior to that thought of becoming a Buddhist. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So it sounds as though he's got the combination of academic philosophy, but also deep belief in it and commitment, and some level of personal experience also.
That's right. That's right. I came across an interesting quote just in preparing for the talk. He wrote a short piece on the death of her name's gone. English mystical writer Evelyn Underhill, whom he knew. And it's interesting, he wrote a piece at the time of her death commemorating her. And he said that, and I'm paraphrasing, that she was, in addition to being a theoretical describer of the way of devotion, was one who practiced it just as much.
Yes.
And what the impression I got from his description was that he was the same.
Yes.
That he recognized that in her, and that he practiced the devotional way of life, not just spoke about it.
Yeah. So I'll just say this again, if you're watching this live, do put any questions you have in the comments, because we will have time, I hope, for a question. So tell us any influences from T.S. Eliot in contemporary life. There was, of course, the musical Cats.
Well, I suppose we have to start with Cats. Cats, the musical by Andrew Lloyd Weber, uses Eliot's book, Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, as its libretto. In fact, it basically just uses that book. There are a couple of other pieces put in. The famous piece, Memory, was not part of that book, but it was composed by the director at the time when it was first staged, based on one of Eliot's earlier poems called Rhapsody on a Windy Night. So that's where the inspiration for that came from. Yes, very, very famous. He won a Tony Award posthumously for the best book for a musical in 1983.
Which he never deliberately wrote. That's really quite funny, isn't it?
That's right.
Okay, so I think you told me previously that T.S. Eliot really created 20th century poetry. Would you like to just say a little bit about that?
My view is that he, not solely, but he was a major force in English literature and created what we now regard as poetry. The style of poetry which had preceded him in the 19th century, people like Wordsworth, Keats and Shelley, was a particular style of romantic poetry. When Eliot published his first set of poems in 1915, the reviews regarded them as outrageous and bizarre. That was the way they were described. It was a completely different style to what had been used previously. And it is a style which has been described as symbolist or imagist. It doesn't tell a story as had been used to in previous poetry. It was a series of images which seemed disconnected often, hard to see the thread that runs through them. They seemed like a whole of disparate images thrown together. Mm-hmm. He also was a champion of quoting other writers directly in his poetry. So, for instance, we talked about the four quartets earlier. He quotes people like Julian of Norwich in that poem. He quotes the Cloud of Unknowing, the sort of a medieval spiritual mystical text. He didn't just do that. He took quotes from all over the place, really, from people like Dante, for instance. He was very well read. in European literature apart from English literature. It just seems to me that he created what we now regard as poetry. What we as when you read a poem, if it sounds like Eliot, then you think it's poetry.
Yes.
I don't think we really realize that now. We read poetry like his, or develop based on his inspiration in current writers who don't realize that at the time, in the early 20th century, when he started writing, that it was quite, it was regarded as weird, the style.
Yes, that's been a big change then in this time, hasn't it? We've got one question here, Maura Murphy. Any thoughts on what Eliot meant by the phrase, only in time is conquered? I'm not sure if Maura's trying to quote from the quote we had earlier. Maybe to speak more generally, what was his position on time?
Well, this comes from the four quartets, and it's often described as a meditation on time and timelessness. And I think the idea here is transcendence, that somehow through the movement, the dance, which we talked about earlier, that is based on the still point, somehow by transcending that movement of time and space, that one comes to a place of timelessness, which he called the still point of the turning world. I think that's what it's talking about here.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Maybe I can ask you, you've been reading T.S. Eliot, I know, probably since a teenager, I imagine.
Yes.
How has this affected you? How has this really influenced your life?
I was astounded when I first heard it. I recall my English teacher reading one of his poems in our class, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Somehow it just sort of sang in my ears. I think the thing that it initially said to me was that there was something transcendent about the world, or beyond the world, that he spoke about something which wasn't immediately obvious, that was a mystery, I guess, but which somehow you could find. And I think it in part inspired my interest in philosophy and my practice of philosophy later on in life, in this sort of sense. The other thing which I could say about his poetry is that it speaks of all ages. It's part of the transcendence, that the way he seems to put together images from all sorts of different times and locations, as if they all come together. They all somehow are joined together by an unseen or unknown thread. I think that's, when I read the poetry, I'm generally reminded that there is something joining all of this together, which is not really evident, but which can be known, or at least can be felt, I guess is the way to describe
it. Great. You had a little line about coffee spoons.
Oh, yes, one of my favourite lines is from the first poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and he says, "I have measured out my life with coffee spoons."
Yeah.
I love remembering that, because it just reminds me, I guess it's a reference to the transcendence I spoke about just a little earlier, that you can get caught in the activity of life, and it just, it's like being measured out with coffee spoons. So yes, no, I'm inspired by that line.
I like the coffee spoons. So we try and end the Philosophy Live with what's a thought for the day, something that everyone can remember through the day. What's a final short thought from T.S. Eliot that could help everyone today?
Well, I don't think you can go past at the still point of the turning world. I think that beyond the coffee spoons, I think that's a really pithy reminder that despite what's going on in the world around us, no matter how the world is turning, there's a still point that all of this depends on. And to remember the still point and not be caught up with the turning world, I think is very helpful.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Rex. Thanks for joining us all the way from Brisbane. We really enjoyed hearing your enthusiasm and your knowledge here. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Christine.
So thank you for joining us, for watching. That brings us to the end, which I could say not with a bang nor a whimper, but hopefully brings us to that still point. If you've enjoyed this interview, please like it and share it. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and definitely subscribe on YouTube. We will be back next week with another Philosophy Live. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye for now.